Now that we have login and logout working, we're going to go ahead and make a few small improvements, and maybe one or two large ones, depending on how you feel about it, to make it so that our users have a little bit of a quicker or cleaner user experience as they interact with these. The first way I'm going to get started is simply by linking to the login and logout pages. You can see that I'm in templates base, and I'm simply writing a condition here. I assume that I'm always going to have a list, and I'm either going to show a logout link in the event that the user is authenticated, or in the event that the user is not authenticated, I'm going to pass in a link for login and allow them to click that to then go in and fill out the form from the template that we programmed in the last lesson. Now, what may not be clear here is that there is in none of our views are we deciding to pass in a user. By default, Django will actually put a user into all of the template contexts. If the user is authenticated, we'll have the actual user object available to us within the template. However, if there is no user or that user is not authenticated, Django will pass in the anonymous user object, and so you will still have the ability to run this. There are no strange errors, no strange behaviors. It's just an object that user.isAuthenticated will always return false for. So this is where we're going to get started, simply providing links for the user to be able to click so that they can actually log in and log out. Now the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to shift over to another tab here, is I'm going to add a new setting, logout redirect URL to auth login. What we'd seen at the end of the last lesson is that when we click the logout button, or when we go to the logout page, we're brought to a page that says, "Thank you so much, you've been logged out, go somewhere else." That's not necessarily how we want this to work, and as we saw at the very beginning of this lesson, in the first sub-lesson that sort of previewed what we were going to build, we saw that upon logout, we were redirected to the login page, and there was a nice little notification at the top that said, "Thank you very much, you have been logged out." That's what this is doing, is we're simply redirecting to the login page here using this setting. And just shortly, we'll see how to add that message. You can also see that I've gone ahead and removed the logout template here from registration, as we won't be needing it. Now, the messages that I spoke of earlier are from Django's message framework, where you have the ability to set a message. But to generate those messages, we have to have some ability to say, okay, login has worked, place a message. Logout has worked, place a message. So what we're going to do to try and connect these two is to use Django's signal system. Now, this would not be necessary if we were using our own views, right? We would write our own view, and then at the end of the view, before returning the response, we would be able to go ahead and say, oh yeah, use the messages framework provided by Django to go ahead and add a message to the message framework, which the message is then added in via middleware, but that's not quite important at the moment. But we don't have access to the views, right? These are views that are provided by Django, and so we need to go ahead and try and plug in a different way, which is where we use the signals. So Django contrib has a set of signals that we can simply import, and you can see that it has a signal for when the user is logged in and when the user is logged out. And from the messages contrib module, I'm pulling in a function called success, and from dispatch, I'm pulling in receiver. And this is what we're saying is a receiver for a signal. So I'm then going to program a function here, and I'm going to say I would like to receive when the user is logged in, when this signal is sent. And so we then go ahead and we say, okay, well, when we see that the user is logged in, when we receive this signal, we would like to call this, and we expect that we have some ability to see the sender, and we will be given a whole bunch of keyword arguments. The first keyword argument I'm going to pull out is the request object, exactly what you think it is, and the next thing I'm going to pull out is the user. And from the user, I'm going to go ahead and get the short name, and finally, I'm going to call success with the request, which has to be the first argument because of the way it works in the middleware. And again, a little bit outside the scope of what we're doing here. And then you can simply see that I say, we have successfully logged in as name. which is the name of the user. And for testing purposes and to ensure that nothing goes catastrophically wrong, I say fail silently so that in the event something has not plugged up correctly, we ignore it. Now that means that this is a little bit harder to test, which is somewhat unfortunate, but this is hopefully pretty clear as to what's going on at this point, right? A user is going to log in, Django contrib auth is going to send a signal, the receiver sees the signal, calls our method thanks to some Python decoration, and then we're simply going to call the messages framework and say, yes, we have success, the user has correctly logged in. The display logout message is more or less exactly the same thing. We say when the user logged out signal is sent by contrib auth, we would like to receive it. And upon receiving that signal, we are going to then display a logout message where we say success, we pass it to the request, and we say, yes, you successfully logged out. And so that is how that is going to work. Now, signals in this signals.py sort of exists on its own, and Django doesn't know anything about it. And so we have to let Django know to run this code, or specifically we have to let Python know it needs to run this code. And so to do that, we're actually going to use the app config setup. So you can see I'm in source user apps.py. And what I've done is I haven't changed any of the defaults. I've just added a method called ready, which will be called after all of the user configs have been loaded by the Django settings runner. When Django gets started, it will go through, it will configure all the apps, and then it will run ready once all the apps are ready to go. So when it's ready, all I'm doing is importing user signals. This is just so my linter doesn't yell at me, because all we're trying to do is get Python to go through there and then to use the receiver decorators to properly wire that up for signal receiving. So that is what enables us to display messages when a user logs in and logs out. Now finally, we have to actually display the messages. So you can see I've gone here into source templates base, and I have said if there are any messages, and again, these messages will be injected by middleware into our template context, and so when we render this out, we simply say, if we see any messages, we're just going to display a list of messages, and then we go through this list. Messages can have tags, and so specifically, when we issue a success message, we expect that there is going to be a success tag on this, and we're simply going to use it as a class so that in the event that we use we have success, we can display it in green. Maybe we use an error message some point in the future. Well, we can display that in red. There are all sorts of things that you can do. If we don't detect a message tag, we can go ahead and just add it to the list. And then, of course, we need to display the message here. So this is how we are actually going to be displaying the messages when we issue them in our signals, or when we receive the signals. Let's take a quick look at that in action. I'm going to come over to the tab over here. I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to do docker compose up. I'm going to copy and paste this and come over to here, although it turns out I already have this loaded. Now I'm going to log in and then enter my credentials, if I can remember them. Aha, there we go. And you can see that, as expected, it says successfully logged in as Andrew. And we can then go ahead and inspect our code. And I'm just going to shortcut it here. You can see we have a class messages, and we are using the class success as expected, and there's the actual message being printed out. And if we had several of these, we would go ahead and display several of these. Now that we have messages being displayed and even links to our login and logout page, there's only one last thing to do, which is to make sure that we can use the next parameter from the URL and allow our login page to redirect to whatever page we were on or whatever page we want to be directed to in the event that we've had a permission deny us access to that page. To get started, we will move into our templates under the registration namespace and into the login.html, which has the form which allows users to log into that we've seen previously. Now, previously, the code that was in here was only what was on lines 2 through 5, and then lines 12 through 14. Lines 6 through 11 are new, and you can see that they refer to the next variable. Our view provided by Django is going to provide a next variable into the template context in the event that it has shown up when we issued the GET request and it found it in the URL query parameters. If it's there, Django will then give us this variable and we can say, yep, we see it. Let's go ahead and create an input. We make sure that the user doesn't see it by making sure it's hidden. We name it next so that Django is able to recognize it when we issue the post request. And then we just put whatever the value that Django is giving us via the login view. This way, when we hit the login button, we will submit the post action with the next data within it, and the post action will then go ahead and know to redirect us in the event authentication has occurred correctly. Now, that's for when this is being specified, and Django will, by default, specify this if we are denied access. So let's say that we have added permissions to a form that allows us to create tags. If we are not authenticated, Django will say, no, you need to be logged in, you need to have permission to do this, so please log in. And by the way, because you are on this form that I've denied you from accessing, I know that I will create the next URL query param so that I will then redirect you back to that page upon successful login. But let's say that we were simply on a startup list page. We're allowed to be there, but then we try and log in. Well, by default, we're currently going to end up on the root page. Well, that's kind of annoying. We were on the startup list page. I want to come back to the startup list. So how do we do that? Fairly easy. We're going to go ahead and we're going to change the base template, and we're simply going to say, well, we would like next to be wherever we currently are. That way, if I'm on startup list, we're simply going to put the URL for the startup list right here. And if I decide I'm going to go and log in, I'm then going to tell Django, oh yeah, just bring me right back to wherever I currently am after logging in. These two in tandem enable all of the redirection that we need with login and puts us in a very good position for authentication.